Hey there, I'm Ryan Boehme, and you're tuning into So You Want to Teach Percussion. This video series is designed particularly for my current Percussion Methods students. Since they aren't able to have a typical Percussion Methods experience due to the current global pandemic, these videos are designed to give them a foundation of the technique outside of class time so that we have more time to play when we're together. But I also hope this video series can be helpful to any music educators out there. Today, we're talking about bass drum. Bass drum is one of my favorite instruments. It's the lowest sound in any ensemble, and when you feel that bass drum note, you know. It might look like a simple instrument, but there are actually a ton of considerations when it comes to playing bass drum. In this video, we're going to talk about how your students should approach bass drum to achieve a broad palette of sounds. To make that happen, we're going to look at playing position, playing technique, and mallet choice.
Mr. Bowman, I'm all about that bass.
Me too, generic percussion student. Me too. First, we're going to talk about playing position. In Fundamental Technique Part 1, we talked about playing position for snare drum. And while a lot of those concepts apply here for bass drum in terms of not reaching out to play, being super relaxed, etc., our approach to bass drum is going to need to be very different from our snare drum approach. With bass drum, you're playing a much larger drum that's sitting in a more vertical position. And since it's such a large drum, we're going to have to do some extra work physically to control the sounds that we're making. So, let's take a look at our playing position. Start by standing behind the bass drum. Position yourself so that the drum is slightly to your left. We're going to be playing with only our right hand for about 90% of our bass drum playing. I've played in ensembles with a lot of left-handed percussionists, but I've never seen any of them turn the bass drum around to play with their left hand. There's usually not enough time between pieces or enough space in the back of the room to turn the bass drum around. So if you're left-handed, sorry about that. What you're seeing right now is actually the conductor's perspective of the bass drum. So once I start playing, you can imagine I'm looking at the conductor. I like to keep a trap table in front of me so that I can switch mallets quickly if needed. And if I was reading music on a music stand, it would go directly in front of me and above the trap table so that I can see my music and the conductor at the same time. In order to control the sounds we're making with the bass drum, we're going to need to be pretty physically involved. Our first step in getting more physically involved is resting our right knee on the batter head. Some bass drum stands are equipped with a footrest, which makes this pretty simple. But if your bass drum stand doesn't have a footrest, you can use the bottom of a short snare drum stand as the footrest. If you don't have one of those, you might try using a short chair or a stepping stool or something else. If you don't have anything to use as a footrest, you can instead drape a large towel over the top of the drum. Then you can attach a triangle clip to keep the towel steady. With or without a footrest, you want to make sure you can also reach the resonant head with at least a few fingers on your left hand. Even with a knee or towel dampening our batter head, the resonant head is still going to vibrate a lot. Being able to dampen the resonant head with your left hand is going to add even more control of note duration. Now with the right hand, we want to make sure we have access to this area of the batter head, basically a straight line from the rim to the center. Due to the size of bass drums, you're going to have to move the right arm a little bit as you go between the different playing zones. But when you're resting the mallet near the center of the head, you should feel totally comfortable, and wherever you're playing on the head, you want to keep the wrist as neutral as possible. It's very different from our snare drum posture, but it's still important to make sure we're relaxed and feeling good before we play a single note. Refer to Fundamental Technique Part 1 if you need a refresher on general percussion posture mistakes that you and your students should avoid. Now, we're going to talk about playing technique. In terms of grip, holding a bass drum mallet should feel a lot like holding a drumstick. A bass drum mallet is generally going to have a wider diameter and feel heavier than a drumstick, but we can still find our fulcrum and gently cradle the mallet. We can absolutely use the same technique we learned for snare drum. If you use a door knocking motion with the wrist, keeping the fulcrum relaxed and the back fingers open, you can get a nice sound out of the bass drum. Even with slow velocity or speed of the mallet, I'm still able to activate the whole drum. If I add velocity, I'll start to get a heavier front to the sound. But a concert bass drum is a much more versatile instrument than a snare drum in terms of available sounds. There are a few specific aspects that go into your bass drum sound. and technique is one of them. So we know our usual snare drum technique works nicely, but notice the difference when I use more of the forearm. This is useful when you want to add more weight to the sound and activate more of the drum's lower frequencies. Depending on the type of articulation I'm aiming for, I can also mess around with incorporating different amounts of wrist along with the forearm. I talked about something similar in the snare drum rudiments videos. When my wrist is out of the equation, I lose this arc motion of the stick, and I instead get this more up and down motion. But it doesn't have to just be one or the other. You can mess around with different amounts of arc motion and up and down motion to achieve a wider array of articulations. So with a motion that's engaged more from the forearm, I can get a heavy, full sound that isn't incredibly punchy at the beginning. But if I'm looking for a sharper front to the note, I'll add some wrist to the equation. But at the same time, you also have to think about rhythmic context. If I'm playing fast repeated notes, I don't want to use too much forearm since the arm is such a huge muscle group. Instead, I would want to use more wrist and keep the mallet closer to the head so there's not as much distance to travel. Your playing zone, or the spot on the head that you're hitting, is also going to affect your sound. In the very center of the head, you'll get a punchy, articulate sound. As I gradually move away from the center, listen to how the sound changes. So as I move from center to edge, the articulation decreases and the resonance increases. This is true for all membranophones, or instruments that make sound by the vibration of one or more membranes. The best part is that none of these sounds are really wrong. You just want your students to be aware of the drastic difference they can make by moving the mallet up or down ever so slightly. Combine that with your knee or towel, and with what you know about playing technique, and you can find just about any sound you need for any musical context. If I'm playing a march, for instance, with a lot of repeating notes that need to sound articulate, I'll probably want to stick closer to the center of the head. If I use my wrist and I keep my back fingers a little tight on the mallet, I can get an even stronger articulation. Finally, I can also add my knee to the head, just to cut out some resonance and give the articulation a little more emphasis. But if I'm playing a ballad that has only a few isolated notes, I might aim off-center, finding a spot where I can incorporate some forearm. My grip is super relaxed here, which allows the weight of the mallet to do more of the work. Depending on what's going on musically around me, I may be able to keep my knee off the drum, allowing it to ring and fill out the low overtone spectrum of the ensemble sound. There are also some instances where your students are going to need to play bass drum rolls. These are played just like the single stroke rolls that we looked at in Snare Drum Rudiments Part 1. If it's meant to be a more subdued roll, you might have your students play with each mallet close to the edge of the drum, using a super relaxed grip and no added dampening. This lets the drum sing, and the relaxed grip reduces the volume of the initial articulation. If my grip is too tight, I lose the lower dynamic range, and I risk sounding too articulate. We're aiming for more of a low, sustained rumble here. Also, notice the speed of the hands. I don't have to play super fast here, because the drum is taking care of a lot of the sustain by itself. But if I play a crescendoed roll, I'll need to increase my hand speed throughout the crescendo, which is going to get the drum speaking more and more. And I'll want to move closer to the center of the drum as I crescendo, since loud playing near the edge of the drum isn't going to give me that characteristic low sound. To summarize, in terms of playing technique, here are 3 aspects you need to keep in mind for anything you play. Grip. Should you keep it relaxed, or should you add a little more back finger to get a little more articulation? Mallet motion. Can I afford to use the forearm, or do I need to stick with a smaller muscle group due to the rhythmic context? Playing zone. Where should I hit the head to have the best chance of achieving the sound that I'm going for? Once your students understand these aspects of bass drum playing, and they understand the musical context of what they're playing, they can mess around with all these technical aspects and find a ton of good sounds. And they'll realize that playing bass drum is a lot more than just boom. Finally, we're going to talk about mallet choice. Even if your students take all the technical aspects into consideration, their sound choices are still going to be a little bit limited if they don't have at least a few different types of mallets to choose from. There are a ton of different brands and mallet types out there, so shopping for mallets can be kind of daunting. But I'm going to cover the main types of bass drum mallets that you're going to want for your students. A general bass drum mallet is going to be your most versatile kind of mallet. I've been using this mallet for everything in this video so far. It can do a lot of things well, as the name suggests. General mallets have a head that's large and fluffy, so it's definitely useful for playing that isn't too articulate. But if you're looking for a more articulate sound, and you aren't able to find that sound by manipulating the technique or the playing zone, you'll want to invest in a staccato mallet. These will be useful for marches, or any other musical piece that calls for heavily articulated notes. The head on these mallets is going to be smaller than a general mallet, with a felt exterior that's likely going to be tighter and less fluffy than a general mallet. Like I mentioned before, your students will sometimes need to play rolls. Ideally, you'll want your students to use a pair of identical bass drum mallets. You could use a pair of general mallets for this, or you can invest in a pair of rollers. These look pretty similar to general mallets, but the weight may be a bit lighter since their main purpose is to be used for rolls. With rollers, your students have the best chance of each hand sounding the same. So as long as your students have access to a general mallet, a staccato mallet, and a pair of rollers, they should be able to make most or all of the sounds that you're ever going to need them to make. I hope this video has helped you gain a better understanding of concert bass drum. At first glance, it may not look as involved or as cool as some of the other percussion instruments, but it plays a crucial role in any ensemble. And once your students know just how many things they can do with it, they'll realize that it's actually really fun and engaging to play. That's it for now. I'm Ryan Boehme, and thanks for tuning in to So You Want to Teach Percussion.